And we're back. Now we're talking about post-World War II and what changed. In a word, communism. Yes, what happened basically between pre-World War II and post-World War II to foreign policy is the advent of communism, because that became our most pressing concern over everything. Essentially, after World War II is a similar situation to what happened after World War One. Remember how I said after World War One the US is the only country left standing? Well, after World War II it was basically just us and Russia really wasn't standing all that well. But the US and Russia still around, and the US and Russia, of course, were opposite of each other in that they were communist and we weren't. And both the US and Russia scrambled to try to remake the world in our image after World War II. So, for example, in Europe, the eastern half of Europe fell under Russia's control, under their influence, and they became communist. And the US exerted our pressure over the western half of Europe in order to keep them from not becoming communist. This became the concept of the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain refers to an imaginary line that separates the communist and the not communist European countries. Again, the Iron Curtain refers to an imaginary line that separates the communist and not communist European countries. The term was coined by Winston Churchill, who talked about an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. And when we talk about Iron Curtain countries, you're generally talking about the eastern one, the communist ones. But the Iron Curtain became, again, this concept of half the world had fallen under the influence of communism, and we had to protect them and keep the Iron Curtain from expanding. Part of the reason why we called it the Iron Curtain is that it was very mysterious. The Russians didn't let people in or out of these countries, and so as a result it was like a gigantic wall made out of iron that no one knew what was going on beyond that. And so we were determined to keep the Iron Curtain from expanding, to keep any more countries from falling under communism. Now, the reason why we call this, this is getting into the period called the Cold War. The Cold War is everything essentially from World War II up until 1990. And it's marked by a period of aggressive talk, but not aggressive moves between us and the Soviet Union, Russia. The reason why this is a Cold War, or is called the Cold War, is because a Cold War is one that does not involve shooting, whereas a hot war is one where there's actual violence. The Cold War was a Cold War. We never actually went to war with Russia. And the reason why we never went to war with Russia is because of MAD. MAD stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. MAD is an acronym. It stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. Mutually Assured Destruction. Basically what that means is, no matter who fires nuclear weapons, there's going to be enough time for the other country to fire back. So, for example, if we launched nuclear missiles at Russia, there's about a 5-minute period in time between the missile launch and them blowing up Russia. That's more than enough time to turn the key and fire back at us. So no matter who fires first, we're all gonna die. And so as a result, this is why it's a Cold War, because there's no point in starting a shooting war, because all we do is end up killing ourselves as well. So the Cold War is marked by a lot of aggressive talk and a lot of movement, but no real direct conflict between us and Russia out of fear of causing the end of the world. So if we can't just blow up the communists, what's our other option? President Truman sets out his plan for ending communism, and with the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine is the official US policy when it comes to communism, pretty much during the entirety of the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine says that we will give aid to any country that is fighting communists. We will give aid to any country that is trying to fight the communists. The logic behind the Truman Doctrine is built into this concept called containment. Containment, the principle of containment is that communism only works if everyone does it. If everyone in the world is communist, then it can work. But if there's even 1 or 2 countries that aren't, that offer a choice, then communism fails. So the solution is contain communism from growing. If it can't expand, then it can't grow, and it can't thrive, and it can't take over the world, and it'll eventually starve out. So the logic was, by keeping communism contained only within a few countries, it'll eventually run itself out. It'll starve, and we won't have to do anything. Hence the Truman Doctrine. By giving aid to the countries that are fighting the communists, we're going to keep communism contained in the places it's already made it and already infected, and so as a result, it won't bother the rest of us anymore. At least that was the theory. We put this into action with things like the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was our plan to financially build up Western Europe after World War II. It basically involved giving large sacks of money to the governments of France and West Germany and England to get them propped back up so they would not become communist. The Marshall Plan is just sort of the biggest and most dramatic version of this, but we do this all throughout the Cold War. We give aid to countries just so they don't become communists. That's all there is to it. We're giving them money and supplies so they don't become communist. The next big doctrine is the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Eisenhower Doctrine expands on the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine is just all about communism. The Eisenhower Doctrine says that the Middle East is a vital part of U.S. foreign policy, and we will do anything we can to defend that area. So the Eisenhower Doctrine basically puts the Middle East into essentially the Monroe Doctrine territory. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine said that we would defend Western Hemisphere? The Eisenhower Doctrine expands that to the Middle East as well, saying that we will do anything we need to defend the Middle East because it's vital to our interests. Ostensibly, this was about economics and communism, but really it's beyond that. It's just we will do anything we need to. It was sparked by the Suez Crisis, in which the Suez Canal of Egypt was almost taken over by a fight between the English and the Russians. And the U.S. essentially reserved the right to stick our nose in there and saying that we're going to keep the Suez Canal open because it's a vital interest to us. So in this case, it was less about communism and more about economics. The Nixon Doctrine is the next one up. The Nixon Doctrine it said that while we will give aid and defense to any country fighting communists, we expect them to do the actual fighting. So again, while we will give aid and support to any country fighting the communists, we expect them to do the actual fighting. This is a direct result of the Vietnam conflict, because remember that Johnson and Kennedy have already had Vietnam. Nixon's coming in at the tail end of Vietnam, and so as a result, he's dealing with a lot of unhappy people at home, people who argued that we should never have been in Vietnam, that we should leave Vietnam immediately. But Nixon's also aware of the fact that simply just abandoning Vietnam doesn't make us look any good on the international stage. So the Nixon Doctrine is sort of a compromise. What the Nixon Doctrine says is we are not backing down from the Truman Doctrine. We will still do anything in our power to stop communism. But we are not going to give you just a blank check. We're not going to come in guns blazing and sacrifice hundreds and thousands of our men just so that you guys can sit back and watch the fun. So in the case of the Nixon Doctrine, he's specifically talking to Vietnam, saying, you know, we'll give you aid, but you guys are going to have to do the fighting because we're sick of this. And so the Nixon Doctrine also became part of the reason why, like, we armed the rebels in Afghanistan. We gave them weapons rather than going in ourselves, because we will do anything to help fight communism, but again, we expect you to do the actual fighting. The Carter Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine is very similar to the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine basically just expands the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Eisenhower Doctrine was specifically talking about the Suez Canal and the Middle East. The Carter Doctrine expands that further into the Persian Gulf and Mesopotamia region. So all really the Carter Doctrine is an extension of the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine was a response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So Carter's simply expanding that. The other difference between the two is that Carter is a little bit more aggressive than Eisenhower. Eisenhower was talking about economic support. Carter is much more pointed about the right to use military support if necessary. The next one up, the Reagan Doctrine. Reagan's doctrine says is a much more aggressive version of the Truman Doctrine. The Reagan Doctrine says that we will give aid to anyone fighting communists, and this includes rebel groups as well. Whereas Truman Doctrine was only talking about like sovereign nations, we would give aid to sovereign nations fighting communism. The Reagan Doctrine says it doesn't even have to be a sovereign nation. We will give aid to guerrillas, that being guerrilla armies, not the actual animals. But we will give aid to anyone that is fighting the communists. Again, even if it basically means fomenting a revolution, that's what we're willing to do. And you could see this with like the Iran-Contra affair, with lots of Latin American and African quote-unquote freedom fighters. The U.S. government gave them weapons and aid because we viewed a rebel group as more potentially profitable, if you will, than a communist government. So again, it's a bit more of an aggressive version of the Truman Doctrine. And most recently, you've got the Bush Doctrine. Now, of course, the Bush Doctrine, this is George W. Bush, so the son. George W. Bush is coming into power, of course, after the fall of communism. The Cold War ends in 1990 when the Soviet Union gives up communism and just becomes Russia, and the Iron Curtain falls, and the Berlin Wall comes down, and David Hasselhoff sings and dances a lot. Seriously, look it up on YouTube. It's fun. Communism stopped being the world threat. It stopped being the boogeyman. And then September 11th happened, and it got replaced by the concept of terrorism in all of its forms. So the Bush Doctrine basically takes the Truman Doctrine and the Reagan Doctrine and just takes out the word communism and inputs the word terrorism. The Bush Doctrine says that we will go do anything possible and give aid to any country or do anything imaginable in the efforts to stop terrorism. So this, for example, was our explanation for why we could go into Iraq and why we could go into Afghanistan, is we're going to go in there to stop international terrorism, and we will give aid to any country that's dealing with international terrorism, and so forth. There is a subset of the Bush Doctrine, though, which is referred to as the Powell Doctrine. The Powell Doctrine refers to General Colin Powell, who was President Bush's first Secretary of State. The Powell Doctrine was in regards to the Iraq War, and what the Powell Doctrine basically says is we need to, in order to prevent future terrorism, we need to maintain order in the countries that we interfere with. The General Powell referred to as the Pottery Barn Rule. If you break it, you buy it. So in other words, if we intervene in these countries, we need to be prepared to put it back together. So the Powell Doctrine is the explanation, for example, why we're still with Iraq and Afghanistan. Because we destabilized the governments when we kicked out Saddam Hussein and the Taliban, respectively. So we have to make sure that we're there to keep everything stable and everything running again, because otherwise all you're going to be doing is creating more chaos. So the Powell Doctrine is like a refining of the Bush Doctrine. We still reserve the right to go into other countries to end terrorism and put down threats. But the Powell Doctrine recognizes that we may need to go back and fix some of the things and stick with it to keep the keep the world functioning better. Okay, that's a lot for the brief history of U.S. foreign policy. Now, the last thing we're going to get to is the Roman numeral 4 about who makes foreign policy. So that's next.